Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we also have 24 personalities, but we don't make a meal out of it. I'm Anna Bogutska, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, welcome. We're currently in the final stretch of this fourth series of the podcast where we're looking at teen horror movies in depth, bending the definition of what exactly makes a teen horror film and exploring why teenagers, and especially teenage girls, make for some of the most compelling protagonists and villains of the genre. First of all, an apology from me. There was no episode last week because I got sick, just the flu, nothing serious, but because of that, I quite literally lost my voice, so I couldn't speak for days on end, and not for more than 2 minutes without sounding like a croaky chipmunk, and obviously because of that, I couldn't record anything. And with that said, we are back on track, and this week are bringing you a discussion of two unconventional horror sequels. The 2013 take on Evil Dead and 2016 Split, which was a true return to form from M. Night Shyamalan. Joining me to go over this double bill of unwell female protagonists is film critic and regular podcast guest Layla Latif. A quick reminder, you can follow the Final Girls on Twitter and Instagram at the Final Girls UK. And if you can spare a few seconds of your day and you enjoy this podcast, please do leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. They really help people discover the show, and I really enjoy reading them. If you're new to this podcast, please keep in mind that we talk spoilers from the very beginning, and think about this in particular for Split. So if you haven't seen that one yet, there is going to be conversations about the ending pretty much from the start. And with all of that said, please enjoy our takes on Evil Dead and Split. Layla, welcome back. I'm very pleased that on the week that my voice has finally returned after a cold and I can finally record again, we get to do this together and about these two batshit crazy movies.
We do, and I feel like these two have got like that nice combination of like a bit of like nostalgia for me. Like I feel quite warmly about both of these films. Like these are the type of movies I'd watch if I had a cold and had to be in bed.
I mean, it's interesting that like you even bring up nostalgia because they're from the 2010s already, and the nostalgia cycle is no longer taking 30 years. It's now taking about 5, because now we're feeling nostalgic about films that were, made 10 years or so ago or less than.
Yeah, I saw someone online talking about like classic movies, and they said Iron Man is one of them, and that just made me want to leave this planet.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those weird things, nostalgia, because it is nice to kind of come back to things, and especially with something like The Evil Dead, which is in itself referring to something much older and reminding us of that as well. But like, there is this slightly grotesque way where it almost feels like it's been made into a commodity for a lot of things. Like with the new Ghostbusters, I just thought that was grotesque.
Oh, I even avoided watching it because I have a finite amount of hours in my life and I do not wish to spend them foolishly. So I already had to endure Morbius. I will not be doing that to myself again.
Oh yeah, and we've got Doctor Strange coming up soon. Let's see if they manage to rebound from that, because I am not having a good time with Moon Knight either. I mean, the Marvel machine is just so dominant in culture. It's weird how like these sort of mid-budget movies, like Split and like The Evil Dead, like feel really novel watching them now, because
they do.
That, like now everything's been like polarized into either tiny indie or giant MCU.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, in the last episode I spoke about the requel of The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which is not a super well-known property, so it doesn't necessarily have that nostalgia factor to sell itself on, but The Evil Dead does. So I think it's both Split and Evil Dead in very different ways are tapping into that nostalgia factor, which we'll pick at the end of the conversation, I think. But let's start with The Evil Dead, which is the 2013 remake / soft reboot / sequel to Sam Raimi's Evil Dead. And before we dig into the film, can you summarize this version of Evil Dead for me?
Okay, so this Evil Dead is about a woman called Mia who is a heroin addict, and her kind of semi-estranged brother and a group of friends take her to a cabin in the wood to help her go through essentially like a cold turkey withdrawal off of heroin and just trying to hopefully stay clean and rebuild her life. Unfortunately, as often happens when teenagers go to a cabin in the woods, somebody finds a cursed book and they read from it, summoning the abomination, I believe it's referred to in this one, which kind of slowly takes over each one of the members and makes them do very, very bad things.
So, first of all, it has the same name as the Sam Raimi Now classic. I think that it's fair to call it a classic in its own right. How do those films and this film connect? Because there's no Bruce Campbell, and it should be noted that, Bruce Campbell being the heart and the protagonist of the Evil Dead franchise, and also at the same time had Ash vs. Evil Dead, the TV show, coming out roughly around the same era. But this is an entirely new set of characters. So how does this premise connect to what we remember of the Evil Dead?
Well, I will slightly correct you that Bruce Campbell is in this film.
Well, I was keeping that for later because he's that stinger makes absolutely no sense, but I still appreciate it.
I just think Bruce Campbell has got like such a presence that if you can get him even for kind of a tiny mid-credit sequence, it's like hard to resist, I suppose.
That's true. I mean, I almost wanted it to be like a life-size portrait of him for no reason, somewhere in the cabin. That would have been just a wonderful wink. I mean, I might commission someone to make that just for me, for my own pleasure.
God, I interviewed him in December and like, I don't know, he's just got something. He's one of the most charming, eccentric, great guys. I so enjoyed talking to him. But so I would say now when it comes to the original Evil Dead trilogy, I watched them wrong and with kind of catastrophic consequences. So I watched 2 and then I watched 3. And then I had that kind of DVD box set, which was like a novelty one that had like, that was that looked like the book and was like really grotesque.
Nice.
And one night I came out home from a nightclub and I was just like, oh, you know what I'm going to do? It's 1 a.m. I'm by myself. I'm going to finally watch the first Evil Dead, assuming I was going to watch some horror comedy. And that's not what the first one is like at all. It's fully terrifying.
Yes.
And I stayed up until dawn, unable to sleep because I was so scared. Because, it like, and this one is very much like the first one.
Mm-hmm.
And even speaking to Bruce Campbell, he was just like, I think what you can feel in the first Evil Dead film was this was an absolutely horrific, traumatic shoot for everybody involved. And they all had the absolute worst time and they barely escaped with their lives. And I think that there is that kind of darkness in the first Evil Dead film, which, the subsequent ones don't have.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this to me didn't feel like so huge a departure from that tone, but it is incredibly nasty and brutish.
Mm-hmm.
But also what I like about it is that there's a kind of sense of like the practical, even like in like the viscosity of the blood and kind of the way that a lot of the gore is done, with nails and broken bone, like it feels very like tangible to me in that sort of like 1980s Evil Dead spirit.
I think that's very accurate because even the director Fede Alvarez, he went on record saying that they spent a lot of time and put a lot of effort and resource into making sure that they were doing practical effects and that VFX was only used for touch-ups, I think. So it does have that very physical feel to it, which obviously looks a lot more slick than the original Evil Dead. But I kind of want to say that your experience of watching them in the wrong order for me seems like the right way, because then the the bizarre violence of the first Evil Dead kind of sneaks up on you once you've already made up your mind of what the franchise is. And, we remember it very much as a comedy horror, and that's how people mostly approach it. And then when they find the original Evil Dead, not Evil Dead 2, which is basically the first one with a different tone, it's kind of a shock to the system. And I think this one kind of went down, completely eviscerated the comedy aspects of it and just went into deep, dark horror.
Yeah, and this was a time when a lot of these kind of remakes, soft reboots, requels, whatever you want to call them, like, Michael Bay was doing a lot of them, and a lot of them came back with, like, oh, we're going to do the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but we're going to just, like, have way more, like, sexual violence and way more, like, gore, and kind of miss basically the entire point of the first film. And I don't think this kind of fully falls into that category, because the Evil Dead was so grotesque. Like, that was kind of what it was originally. So this doesn't feel like a betrayal to me in the same way that, like, every Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake has done. Oh my God, there's been some bad ones.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even the latest one. Well, the latest one is more offensive because it's just mediocre. It's not even bad. But what do you think are the main points of Evil Dead that this film kind of pays homage to or honors in its own nasty way?
I guess that there was just something about, like, the simplicity of Evil Dead, where it's, not bringing in new characters, not bringing in new twists, and just kind of like the idea of, like, an unstoppable force working its way through you, like, very, very methodically. And, like, it not even being kind of a tangible thing that you can really fight. And just, like, that kind of, like, that nightmarish simplicity to that, which I think in some ways there is in Halloween originally as well, about, like, we're not going to over-explain, we're not going to even really have, like, motive, we're just going to have something that is unrelenting and it's coming for you.
Do you think it doesn't over-explain? Because I rewatched the film last night, and I kind of the basic supernatural premise is some random spooky sounding words are read out from the book that they find in the basement, in the very creepy basement. But here we get a little pre-credits flashback. We get a lot more information about the supernatural elements of it. We get a little research montage as well with Lou Taylor Pucci. Kind of, what do you make of how much more time they spend here on the actual supernatural elements of it?
Yeah, I wish they kind of hadn't bothered. Because, it's a bit like, that Rob Zombie remake of Halloween where they tried to give Mike Myers a really, like, a big backstory. And
I love that you call him Mike Myers, like you're diminutive terms, and not disparaging the great Canadian comedic actor Mike Myers.
Sorry, I don't know him personally. Mr. Michael Myers.
It's Michael to you, Layla.
Yeah. I think that kind of tendency to over-explain maybe comes from, like, a little bit of a place of insecurity. Like, as a filmmaker, or at least as a viewer, it feels insecure. Like, when there is that, need to over-explain and kind of give too much motive. Even, like, a little bit with this, like, I get that, you can't just redo something shot for shot, because that's how you end up with Gus Van Sant's Psycho. But, so they bring in this drug element. And, like, the idea of kind of, maybe this is all like a metaphor for kind of the horrors of addiction, which I think sort of works and is absolutely fine, but it is a little bit, when something feels like it's trying to be termed, quote unquote, elevated horror, which I know is a disgusting term, but, it is, it is kind of a distinct subgenre, I suppose. But I really felt that with this, I felt it worked better, but Antlers did it recently as well. Yeah. Where it's just like, the real demon is opiates, addiction. And it's like, sure, but does it have to be? You know what I mean? Like, do we have to kind of shove everything up its own arse?
It's interesting because I never thought that was an ambition of this film in particular, and even rewatching it, like I almost found it very refreshing that it wasn't trying to do that. I find the fact that and we should kind of talk about this. I find the purpose of being in the cabin like quite an interesting take on the, you know, young people will go to a random spooky cabin in the woods and then they will inevitably get slaughtered. Here, there's kind of a reason for it, not just having a fun time. But
yeah,
I really didn't feel like they were trying to shoehorn a metaphor. And I actually found that quite refreshing because you're right. Like sometimes films, you can, I always resent some quote unquote elevated horror attempts because I feel like the filmmakers actually disrespect the genre. They don't want to make a horror film. They want to make a film about something else, but they've shoehorned it into a horror film because it's, I don't know, more commercially viable because of whatever reasons. And that I resent. Because it's,
you see that a lot nowadays.
So much. And I think Antlers is an example of that. I really love the short story that it's based on. That is from a horror writer, but I don't think the director actually really necessarily wanted to make a horror film, but this might just be me projecting it, but that's how it felt.
No, I completely agree with you. And sorry, I've got a cough too. Yeah, that source material short is so good, and I was very, very excited for Antlers as a result because, and you know, you can just read it online. I think it's just it's out there sitting there, and it's great, and such a fantastic ending. But yeah, there is just, I don't know. It's almost, sometimes it feels like these people are like embarrassed that they're making a horror film.
Yes.
In some ways. What's this film? I don't think he feels like anything but love for this genre and anything but love for the source material. Like you'd really feel that this is someone who absolutely adores Evil Dead. And, you know, though I don't think this is anywhere near as good as the original, I do think it's a really, really solid little horror film. God, a friend of mine, Jamie Graham, who works for Total Film, told me when he interviewed Michael Bay about the Texas Chainsaw remake that he did, he said to him, like, oh, have you seen the original Texas Chainsaw? Yeah, it really doesn't hold up. And that as a result, you can see why the remake is so crap.
Holy shit, the audacity.
I know. Can you imagine?
I can, but it's ruined my entire day, this fact. But I do agree with you. I think Alvarez really, really loves and respects the genre. And, you know, and he'd made Don't Breathe after Evil Dead as well. So which is a fantastic horror as well.
Did he make the sequel to that? I didn't enjoy I enjoyed that one very much.
He didn't direct it. He's a producer. And I think he wrote it, but he's not a director on it.
Okay, we'll forgive him.
But I did want to talk about kind of the protagonist, especially Mia, because it's kind of the same premise of Evil Dead, you know, just five young people. I mean, I'm extending the definition of teenager for the purposes of extending the type of films that I could cover in this season. But
hey, they might be teens. I mean, probably 19.
Generic young adults. Between teenagers and young adults, they're all 27. Like, let's face it. So it's fine.
Well, it's hard, can you say, because we have just been trained our entire lives to accept 30-year-olds as being teenagers in all of the like TV shows and films that we watch. So, like, yeah, sure, you can bring me some like middle-aged guy and tell me he's in high school. I'll believe it. I
mean, exactly, which is why being an actual teenager, when you're trained to perceive teenagers as 30-year-olds, is so confusing because everybody looks very different and your expectations are all warped. Like, I think like I look like a teenager now. I was like, oh, I look just like the protagonists of my favorite teenage movies who are all in their 30s. But yeah, what do you make of Mia, who's the reason that this gang kind of end up in this cabin, which, you know, we're shown that it's a tradition, like they used to go there quite a lot.
Yeah. I remember when there was this was announced, I was quite cynical about Jane Levy being cast as Mia because I knew her from like a not very good sitcom that I watched called Suburbicon or something like that.
Yeah.
And she was sort of like perfectly fun and snarky and stuff, but she didn't seem to me to be, someone that could like be the central role in like a kind of iconic horror franchise. But so I was pleasantly surprised by her. I think Jane Levy does have that sort of classic final girl quality to her. That's, slightly sarcastic, witty kind of, but has a sense of like, when push comes to shove, she's got like a lot of internal strength going on.
And also like a sense of vulnerability to her.
Mm-hmm. And there was one of the things that I believe in the original ending, she had, she was going to explode. And Sam Raimi came in and said that like, no, you've got to have this character, she's so good, she's so brilliant, and she's suffered enough.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot then like have, end this film with people, because your audience will just end up being like feeling quite angry and betrayed by you.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that because I always felt with Ash that every time I just wanted him to kind of be able to finally ride off into the sunset and, recover from all of this with the help of like a great therapist and maybe a supportive friend network.
I would love to see Ash Goes to Therapy. I just want to put it out in the universe. Ash Goes to Therapy, please. I love this.
That would be such a funny web series.
Oh my god, it would be such... I mean, there is no reason for Bruce Campbell to host SNL right now. I mean, surely there will be one in the near future. But wouldn't that be a great SNL skit? Ash Goes to Therapy.
Yeah, and just seeing this therapist getting like increasingly overwhelmed by like what amount of work they're going to have to do together.
And then turns out the therapist is a deadite.
Perfect.
There we go.
We need to get in touch with this guy's people. I think he'd do it.
I'm sorry I interrupted you. Keep going.
Because I can't remember where Ash versus the Evil Dead ends up. I think he's in space. But I'm sure they could figure out a way to bring him back. Or I think I don't know.
I can't remember. That show was wild. I think the best thing about the Evil Dead universe, though, is that it is wild, which means that anything is possible.
Yeah, I mean, that was why Evil Dead 3 is so much fun, because they just go for it. I also like really appreciate like the physicality of like Bruce Campbell in these films. Like,
100%.
And I think that's something that we do miss here to a degree. Like, I think he's so athletic and acrobatic in all of the things that he could do, and it's so extreme. I follow him on Twitter. He'll occasionally put up like little videos of him and like the special backflips that he does, and like the injuries that he sustained when making this films, because he's very like plugged into his own fandom. And like I think maybe we did miss that a little bit here,
because the physicality here really is just extreme violence, right? And we should talk about that, because like it dials up the nastiness in a way that is very specific to this era of horror, I find.
Yeah, no, it is incredibly brutal, and like it never stops. It never kind of stops twisting the knife. Like, even there's a particular death where a boyfriend has to kill his girlfriend, and he shoots off her one remaining arm.
Yes.
And then, just like in the final moment, she switches back to herself, so he has to watch her realize that she's shot her and that she's bleeding to death. And that just like, it's so stunningly cruel.
It really is. And also just all the switching between being possessed and unpossessed doesn't necessarily quite hold up. I think like it's just used for the purposes of inflicting more pain on the characters.
Yeah. No, I'm very glad that they really didn't end with, they do at least let Mia survive, because otherwise I think this would have just been too unrelentingly brutal, because like the insane, the absolutely grotesque cutting off of a face, or like the amount of suffering that people go through. So, and that tone is just set in that kind of pre-credit sequence where, of course, it's not just that it's a young teenage girl. It's not just that she's going to be burned at the stake and her father has to kill her, and then she's killed her, her mother. And then it's like, she has to scream, and, why does it have to be the dad? Like, and I think he says something like, "I love you, baby."
Yes.
before he shoots her in the head. And I'm just like, oh, okay. So we're just really dialing everything up to 11 here.
I mean, that's a little bit of that Raimi humor, but obviously it's not Bruce Campbell delivering that line, so doesn't land as funny. But what do you think of the final standoff between Mia and the Abomination? Which is, I think, at some point when I was rewatching this last night, I was like, it's still going. She's still chainsawing through. It's been a full 5 minutes of this.
I did think it was really funny how, obviously kind of tribute to the first one, we had someone having to cut off their arm and then they had to do it again.
Yeah.
2 people had to cut off their arms. I'm just like, guys, we know you watched the first one. We all like that movie.
They have to double or nothing.
But yeah, and I think that's probably where Jane Levy really shows why she was chosen for this role. Like, she's so good as the possessed version of herself and as also the sort of, innocent woman who's trying to get away from this terrible abomination. As sorry, I don't know why. I don't know whether it's like a sympathetic cough that I have.
I think it might be like a psychosomatic sympathetic cough, because you hear me coughing and you're like, oh no, I've now developed a husky voice and a cough too.
But yeah, I think that final sequence where it is also kind of calling back to the original, where it is Mia versus herself, was like a really fun note to end on. But I'm curious what you think about the sexual violence tree rape scene.
Well, this is the thing that a lot of people bring up about Evil Dead, right? Is the tree rape. And it felt as horrific, but it also felt a lot more voyeuristic in a strange way. Like they made a whole point of sort of leading up to that scene. And I think because you're watching it kind of knowing, or at least if you're familiar with the Evil Dead films, you know that scene. And you kind of, when it starts leading up to it, it almost feels like it's setting up weird voyeuristic foreplay for that scene. And that is the thing that I find weird, because it makes it titillating as opposed to upsetting. And the actual scene itself, what I am thankful for is that Jane Levy is fully clothed in that scene, so at least that part. But I'm really trying to justify a scene that is just, it feels more like something out of a strange hentai porno than it is from the Evil Dead movie, if I'm honest. Yeah. So I feel like it dialed up the titillating rather than actually make it a horrible supernatural rape scene. And at the same time, I don't think it had the same effect as the one in the Evil Dead had, because it's a bit too knowing. And I don't think this is the scene that you need to be knowing and winking with.
Yeah. And it's strange. I kind of really assumed that it wasn't going to be in this because I read interviews with Sam Raimi and stuff, and he'd spoken about the scene in the original and that he essentially regretted it. And he was like, I wouldn't do that now. And I know there's stuff on the shoot of that film that is kind of, difficult to hear about someone that I like as much as Sam Raimi. And there's a certain immaturity. They were so young when they made that film. So I was quite surprised that, kind of given all of that time to reflect, they kind of doubled down on it.
And I think it's also, there is one shot in particular that I think is the one that leans too much into the porny side. There's literally, I think you'll know the one that I mean. There's literally just it's a shot of Mia's legs and the branch sort of entering her, and it's kind of framed as though this is how she gets possessed, but nobody else gets possessed like that. That's not the reason why. The whole possession thing is really an excuse. And that just felt very much like, oh, this is so much fun for you, isn't it? Just shooting this and remaking this in a really specific way. Which again, just that knowingness, just it's not scary because it's not I don't think the film wants it necessarily to be scary. It's meant to be titillating.
I agree. Like that, and it kind of really took me out of it, to be honest. Even watching it now, I found myself just kind of like wincing and almost like, yeah, almost just kind of feeling like slightly almost embarrassed for them because
Interesting.
because it just sort of showed a like level of like puerile humor, I suppose, which I just thought, like, guys, you're better than this.
And I think you're right. The legendary filmmaking process behind The Evil Dead is almost, it's like, because they were so young and so inexperienced and made so many mistakes, and that does excuse them to a degree, and you can see how that was completely different in subsequent efforts, but that's not the same here. This is quite a slick production.
Yeah. I'm not saying that, no film can be about sexual violence or sex or anything like that. And I'm a defender of many films that have it in this. It's just, I suppose, when we talked about like that this film feels in some ways like a love letter to the original Evil Dead film, it's when that happens, there's a slight feeling of like, oh well, what did you love about that movie?
I think it's the of the requel thing. Like, you can operate in the same universe, so you can essentially remake it, right? But do you have to remake everything? Do you know what I mean? Like, you can pick and choose the things that you want to remake and not to. But
you can, but I mean, overall, I still think it's this sort of early millennium remakes. This is amongst the best ones.
Yeah, for sure. And it's I think it does understand what made the original one, the scary one, really work. And I think if it was trying to recreate the comedy aspect of it, I think that's when it would have failed, because I don't think you can have Evil Dead as a comedy horror without Bruce Campbell. It's just, you'd have to find someone of equal charm and ability to essentially create a new version of the Ash character. But I think it was wise of them. I think it's so hard to do comedy horror well, and I don't think this was necessarily the team for that. So I think they chose wisely to lean into the nasty horror elements of it.
Yeah, I literally cannot think of a single person that we could like cast like that could do it. Like, of this like new generation of actors trying to go through like who's on Euphoria, who's on like who are the young Gen Zers?
You know who could do it? I mean, he's not that young now, I think. Maybe he's aged out of it, but I think Glenn Powell would have made a good Ash.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
He's got that little snarky humor, and also he's got that sort of, quarterback build, but he's got an interesting physicality where he doesn't position himself as a hunk in the same way as Bruce Campbell kind of never did.
Which is bizarre to me, because I'm very attracted to Bruce Campbell.
I mean, I literally bought and read his autobiography, If Chins Could Talk.
Oh, that's so delightful. He's such a Renaissance man as well. You know, he writes political satire.
No, I did not. Does he really?
Yeah.
I love him even more now.
He's written a whole book recently that was kind of, he'd been very inspired by like what capitalism, how it had broken down because of the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Like, he's a very political person.
I love this.
I love him so much.
So before we move onto Split, is there anything you wanted to mention about Evil Dead?
Only that, like, I believe there's still talk that we might get a sequel, which would be quite interesting, because, like, if they did do a sequel, will they follow the same pattern of it being a tonal sequel, or or will they go straight to kind of, Evil Dead 3, absolutely insane kind of travels through fantasy sort of thing?
I'd be interested to see more of Mia. Like, hardcore, hardened, one-armed Mia. I'd like to see that.
Yeah. Oh, I would too. And Jane Levy's kind of done good other work in the meantime. I mean, yeah, I don't know that I would be interested in necessarily revisiting Evil Dead with this director without her. I think she's probably the thing that I kind of left most impressed by.
Oh, 100% agree. So let's move on to Split, the M. Night Shyamalan film from 2016. Can you summarize the premise of the film for me before we dig into it?
Okay. Right. Sorry, let me just get all my character names up. Okay. So we have Anya Taylor-Joy as Casey Cook, who is a kind of young, shy, retiring teenage girl. And she is getting a lift home with two friends and their dad when the dad gets mysteriously disappeared. And in his place sits a man called Kevin Wendell Crumb, who has dissociative identity disorder. And he has 23 to 24 different identities all moving around within him. Some of them are, 9-year-old boys. Some of them are kind of middle-aged women. Some of them are kind of sexual predators. So he kidnaps the three girls and puts them in a basement, waiting for them to be part of a ceremony in which he will become the Beast, the 24th identity, and kind of, get essentially superhuman powers.
So, I mean, it's rare that a film can be both camp and so deeply problematic at the same time. So
is that rare? I feel like loads of camp stuff is problematic.
I mean, like in 2016, I'm speaking specifically about like this. This is not the 80s. Like we should know better by this point. But I want to talk about this film a little bit in the context of Shyamalan's career. So next to The Visit, which is another very low budget horror film, this really felt like the quote unquote return of him, because he was very much not in director's jail, but not really seen as making good films for a very long time. So where does this film fit into his filmography for you?
No, I am actually genuinely an apologist and a fan of his. And I am the best type of fan in that, like, if I hear that he has a film coming out and it's not very good, I will not go and see it and pretend it never happened. So I have only seen, I know nothing of, like, the Lady in the Water. I have not seen, like, any of those kind of ones just before this, because I was like, you know what, if I'm gonna, like, be like a good friend that if you, like, do something embarrassing on a night out, I will just pretend it never happened and you can, like, and never bring it up again.
Are you the person who, like, goes into his Wikipedia page and just edits out Lady in the Water and that weird film he made with Will Smith?
And I heard that was not good, but it's also none of my business. I don't, acknowledge them as canon, I suppose.
Okay. So, do you acknowledge The Visit and Split as canon?
Yes, I very much like The Visit, and I really enjoyed Split very much. I like Old a lot. I actually probably would even defend The Village. I think The Village is really fun. But even though I would say that this is not one of his funnier films, I always find it insane that he is accused of being like a humorless director, because I think he's really, really witty.
I think he's really funny too. I disagree completely when people say that he's humorless. I find that there's like a lot of sly humor in his stuff. It's just not, that's not the point of any of his movies.
Yeah. I remember when Old came out, there was a critic I really like called Matt Solis-Seitz, and he said that, watching Old, he was just reminded that, like, this is filmmaking as an art form, like I thought that was maybe a little bit over the top, but actually watching this, I was like, I completely am feeling what Matt Solis-Seitz felt when he was watching Old, where just like the actual use of the medium is so interestingly done. The way that he like frames things, the way that the camera moves, the way he just makes like really inobvious choices to kind of like ratchet up tension, and like that was so present in just the way that James McAvoy first appears in the film, is like done in kind of almost like the shark from Jaws, with like holding it back to the last second to kind of get every tiny bit of tension and sinister, and sinister presence to this guy. I love this film. I really do. And I know that it's problematic, and I know that in many ways it's not a masterpiece, but it's just like a reminder of what I want more of. Just like slightly unhinged performances, somebody actually being like a proper filmmaker, like like after watching like something like Morbius, which I know we're both still traumatized by, but and like that flatness and that lack of ambition and that laziness, like there's just none of that here.
No, I agree with you. I think even at his worst, Shyamalan is a proper craftsman. He understands visual language. He understands the language of filmmaking, and particularly how tension works and how suspense works. And I think, we will talk in depth, I hope, about James McAvoy's performance, but I want to start with that very first scene, which is basically the entry point into these teenage girls that we're going to spend a lot of time with, into Casey and their kidnapping. And I found it's such an eerie and just perfectly choreographed scene, I find. What do you make of that setup, essentially?
Yeah, that it's so restrained, isn't it? And like this, and he's got a lot of faith, I think, in his actors to do a lot. So rather than kind of like having like a moment of violence, just really, instead. Again, I'll bring it back to Jaws, but that shot on the beach in Jaws when Brody first realizes that there is a boy being eaten, and they do that, what's it called, like where you do a dolly zoom, is that right? Where you basically move the camera and zoom out at the same time, and it makes, to kind of have that moment of just like horrendous realization really hit home. No, he doesn't do that, but like there is something, I think, of a very similar feeling in just Anya Taylor-Joy slowly turning her head to realize that there's a different man sat next to her.
Oh God!
And I love that he just, he kind of trusts in her face to sell the entire thing.
And it's also it's just so perfectly summarizes as well how she feels without having to have a massive exposition moment. That will come a bit later, but that she's sort of invisible because James McAvoy doesn't even see her until the car makes a sound. She was always there, but completely sort of not visible to him because she's so good at making herself small in the frame.
Yeah. I mean, it's very impressive how quickly you sort of understand exactly who she is. And I don't think it's just because she is of a type like that, like, oh, okay, she's our protagonist, so she's going to be kind of clever and, maybe a bit, I don't know, feisty or whatever, what it is. She's actually something much more like specific than that. And I think you fully get her by like minute 3.
So let's talk about Casey. Kind of who is Casey and how do we learn more about her? How does she evolve throughout Split?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's always obvious that she's someone who has been abused, that she's someone that is like working through trauma. And it's sort of when it's revealed what it is that she's been going through with, her uncle and the self-harm that has subsequently happened. It doesn't feel like a cheap twist, I suppose, but I put most of that down to the fact that I think Anya Taylor-Joy is a very skilled actress, and she doesn't kind of, I don't know, that it doesn't feel like a kind of 2-dimensional trauma teen. You know what I mean?
But what do you make of the way that I mean, I think we're going to be jumping around the ending quite a bit. There is something that I think this is one of the key problems for me of the film, that I didn't think of at that time when I first watched it. But the whole idea of her being special because she's traumatized, I find very too simplistic, and kind of it really reminded me of that speech that that Sansa gives in Game of Thrones, which also riled so many people up of, oh, I'm only this strong and capable now because I was subjected to rape and abuse. And I have this vibe of you can tell a lot of that through, and Shyamalan does, through very economic storytelling and through Anya's performance. But then the whole drilling down into the fact that she's special, she's pure, and she's capable because she's traumatized, or how the film that calls it quote unquote broken, I find that to be way too simple. What do you think?
Interesting. Oh no, I can completely see that point. I guess for me, because she doesn't kind of like save the day or particularly have any like great strength that comes from being traumatized. I don't think that I mean, fundamentally, she is less brave in many ways than her counterparts. They make escape attempts. They're more proactive. They're trying to do stuff. She sort of fails at every turn. So I don't think that there is that whole element of like that her trauma gives her like a superpower, which I agree is like a very difficult conversation that we have to have. And I've seen it in interviews, even, from our colleagues. Like I saw an Alan Cumming interview, and he was horrifically abused. And honestly, the interview, and I think because we have this kind of cultural narrative around it, was just like, oh, but do you at least feel that like in being horrifically abused, that like benefited you as an artist and like helped your creativity or something? And he was just like, absolutely not. I really wish I hadn't been abused.
Yeah, exactly. And that's that kind of making that into like, I genuinely really love this sort of very grounded superhero world that Shyamalan kind of built with Unbreakable and then Split and then Glass. Glass, we're not going to talk about it too much, but, like, it's not the greatest film. But the idea of having kind of people who are very regular people who have what we understand as superpowers, but without going into either a gritty superhero world or purely the MCU, I find really, really rich, really interesting. But justifying that with, oh, you have to be traumatized to develop special powers is, I find that to be like, it's, if it wasn't, especially because it's Casey and because of how it presents it, and because literally the film like undresses her throughout as the film progresses. She like, we meet her, she's like very layered up, she's got a ton of t-shirts and different things on, and then at the final confrontation with the Beast, she's in a tank top because he's like ripped off and her clothes have come off in different points, and that's how he sees her self-harm scars. And you're like, there's so many things that are wrong with that. Like, I appreciate well, not so much subtlety, but kind of how the revelation is done, and it's not titillating at all, but it's just such a weirdly misguided concept.
Interesting. I wonder whether I've just kind of got such a kind of good faith interpretation of everything that happens, that like I am sort of making excuses for it, but I do still feel that like that Casey is not empowered by her trauma. Like, if anything, it's the thing that is like holding her back. Yeah.
For sure. I don't think it tries to say that she's empowered by it. I think James McAvoy's character tells her that she's special or pure of heart because of it, which is what I find problematic. Maybe even, arguably at the same level as I find James McAvoy's character. Maybe even more than his.
Yeah, it's a frequent criticism that you see of him, that he seems to stigmatize mental health
Hmm.
in a very very frequently, because I suppose, like, it's definitely there um in God, what's his? I can't believe this has slipped my mind. His first huge film that he made with Bruce Willis.
Oh, Unbreakable?
No, the one
Oh my
before
god!
that.
Oh my god! The Sixth Sense.
Yes, sorry. It's definitely there in the sixth. I cannot. Can you imagine?
We both slipped there. I was like,
retire.
oh, Unbreakable.
This is like shameful that I forgot the Sixth Sense. Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely there in the Sixth Sense.
Mhm.
Donnie Wahlberg's character. It's there in Signs, with kind of like the way that like depression is treated in Signs is a bit off. We have this, which isn't great. It's there in Old again. Like the person with a mental illness is like evil, essentially.
Mhm.
And they're kind of given a lot of it's not the most progressive portrayal, and particularly I think there's a lot of stigma that happens around even the kind of most manageable of mental illnesses, and I don't know, maybe it's something that he'll grow out of. It seemed like it was going he was doing something different in Servant.
Mhm.
The kind of main woman in that is she's like suffering with kind of, I suppose it's like a postnatal psychosis.
Mhm.
I don't know, I don't want to diagnose a character, but having watched the most recent season, he doesn't treat her great either. So I don't know, it just feels like maybe he's just got a quite shallow way of handling that, and he sees mental illness as a sort of more of a kind of convenient plot point. Like, if you need to have something do something bad, just give him a mental illness and it'll be fine.
So let's talk about that. Like, let's talk about how he portrays split personality disorder, DID, in this film, because it's tailored from, it's telegraphed from the almost the beginning, and then there's quite a lot of time spent with Kevin in therapy, and a lot of separate time spent with his therapist as well, explaining how she views DID working. So what'd you make of that, of the dialing in on this disorder?
I really liked it. I don't know whether it's like, I mean, I actually think that the woman playing the therapist was absolutely fantastic. I hadn't really seen her in anything before, but I think she had such a kind of like a grandeur about her, and like a wisdom about her. Like, I thought that was a really like solid performance. And as much as I can say that it was like really, this is perhaps, I don't know a huge amount about dissociative identity disorder. I know that it's something that has been debated a lot, as to how it manifests and why it manifests. I'm saying this only because I've listened to a You're Wrong About episode about it, which was very interesting.
Yes.
But I am not a mental health professional, so I'm not going to dig in. The thing that I enjoyed, and I can appreciate that maybe this is not like brilliant politically, but it's just acting with like a big capital A. Like, I just think James McAvoy is so giving this his all, and has so developed each character so distinctly, that I think it was just like a really joy to see someone pulling this off.
I think there is, I understand where the criticism comes from, and I do see it as problematic, and I don't know what it says about me that I find the portrayal of Casey actually on rewatch to be more problematic. Maybe because it's just a more sellable form of trauma, but like DID has always been used as such a convenient excuse in thrillers and horror films. I mean, even from Psycho, this idea of a split personality feels almost supernatural in nature, but also is rooted in a real life mental illness that people do suffer from, but they're by default always presented as a psychotic villain, as someone who necessarily one of their personalities is going to be some sort of villain. And at the same time, this is where like the problematics and the campiness comes in. I get so much joy from watching James McAvoy act. I think he's one of the best actors of his generation. And here, like he sort of has that unhinged elements in him in the same way as Jake Gyllenhaal has. And as much as I appreciate them when they're being very understated and thoughtful and, you know, taking their role seriously, but fully embedded in the world in which the film takes place, they also take that to a completely deranged level. So if they're in a film that is not understated and serious, they go like full, they dial up to like 12. And I appreciate that as a viewer because it's a lot of fun. And I can imagine that it's also a lot of fun for them to play.
Yeah, I mean, it to me almost felt like this is that he must be someone that spent a lot of time on the stage. This felt like very like kind of a sort of level of acting skills that seemed straight from the theater, where, you know, maybe one night in some sort of experimental production you were playing 6 different characters and you had to like switch roles. Because I mean I love plays like that. I love like experimental theater and just like let's like explore the potential of this medium. And it just also felt that like as much as this is kind of like B-movie, I guess what I like about it generally, and that comes from like literally the camera work to the performances, but particularly James McAvoy, as it's just like we're going to take something that is kind of B-movie level trashy and we're just going to take it so seriously. We're going to like do it. We're going to do it with like the utmost craftsmanship.
So let's talk about his performance in particular. And there's a few scenes in here that I really hope you bring up where it's just a kaleidoscope of characters. I know in the film he's meant to have 24 personalities, that's including the Beast, but we only really see 8 of them on screen. So what do you make of James McAvoy playing 8 different characters?
So we've kind of got our 2 evil characters really of the 24. There's Dennis, who's sort of the kind of the psychopath, creepy person who likes to be who's kind of got a fixation on teenage girls. But then I think so much scarier is Patricia, who does, I think there is a little bit of a psycho Mrs. Bates tribute with her.
For sure.
But then like, I think the thing that I found like most impressive in terms of like James McAvoy's performance is when he is being Dennis pretending to be Kevin. Barry.
Barry. Yes, sorry. Yes, you're right, Barry.
Yeah, so Barry is the kind of camp, fashion obsessed designer who I think is generally the person, I think I call it is like in the light, but like, so there's someone who's very often in charge, but there are scenes with the psychiatrist where she is it is Dennis, but he's pretending to be Barry. But she is kind of deducing from like tiny ticks that he's not entirely pulling off that performance. But you can, it's so intense that you can actually tell that it's Dennis pretending to be Barry, and you can get that entirely from James McAvoy's performance.
And especially like, you know, that scene where it's towards the end when I think the personalities are sort of fighting for their time. And it's just a close up on McAvoy's face, and he sort of Rolodexes his way through all these characters and all these individual, you know, defining traits that we've seen from them. But it's just all in his face. It's like almost it's not a one take, but there's very few cuts, and you just see him transform with just very subtle facial movements.
It really is very impressive. And I love the kind of level of detail that there seems to be in even the ones that you only see a little glimpse of. I think there's one called Jade, who they said, Jade is the one with diabetes. I was like, okay, that's a choice.
And what do you make
of... There's a moment where the original Kevin comes back, realizing that he has not been in charge of his body for, I think it's 2 years. And like that devastation that he feels was like really, I found that quite a like moving moment. And it reminded me very much of the I think one of the saddest moments in a horror film that I've seen in Get Out, where the gardener for a second gets his body back, and so he immediately kills himself.
Oh, yes.
And that I think about that all the time, and like the horror of like what that character's been through. Really need to kind of separate my my film watching life from my personal life a little bit more, because it is weird. I'm walking around, being like, oh my God, that gardener, what he must have gone through. And like the poor Kevin, like coming back, having been out of his body for 2 years. Like, I love like when a film just has like a tiny moment of just like unspeakable darkness.
And speaking about darkness, then, what do you think specifically about the Beast? Because if we're talking about the subtle physicality, well, subtle might not be the right word, the physicality of his performance, the amount that he does with just his shoulders as the Beast, I found to be troubling.
Yeah, and it really did feel like a radical transformation, and then and I kind of remembered it as a radical transformation, that they kind of maybe done stuff with like prosthetics. And watching it again, I'm not sure that they did. I actually think it might just be mostly performance, that he just seems like a larger, more menacing presence.
There is sorry, go ahead.
So what do you think that he's do you think that they've actually like physically transformed him in that moment?
I think that the thing that I like the most about the Beast is that it's the same man, it's the same body, but it's all about the way that he moves himself and sort of makes specific choices of how to like hunch his shoulders or flex certain muscles to make himself seem so much bigger and just constantly in tension. Like, there's moments when all of his veins are popping, and that just makes him feel so much bigger than he actually is. And it's just control. Like, the elements are still all the same, but it's just what he's doing. Like, tiny choices, tiny movements, just the breathing and the way that his jaw is like clenched and tense all the time. I do like there is like an element of this is too funny and too camp when he starts climbing up the walls, and all I could think about was like the calisthenics TikToks where it's just dudes climbing up walls, hanging on by their fingertips because their core strength is so high. I'm like, okay, show off. But it's not menacing to me. It's just funny.
Oh my God, that would have been, if they were making this now, the promotional TikTok series that they could have gotten McAvoy to do would have been so much fun.
I mean, I am excited for at some point for TikTok to rediscover this film and lose their collective shit over it, because sometimes they do that with random films. Like, they just got really obsessed with Megan is Missing. So why not get obsessed with
Really?
Split? Yeah, just for no reason.
Huh. My TikTok algorithm has clearly not figured itself out, because I would have liked to have seen that.
But what do you think of the Beast as like the big monster of this?
I mean, just like here, it is. I have to come up with a better word than insane, particularly given the context. It is wild that when you think of that, it's the same man who is Hedwig, that is like, who genuinely does feel like a child, and then going into this sort of like menacing, animalistic kind of creature who does seem, I suppose, because like this is supposed to be like kind of a pared down super villain, but like he feels more like a horror monster to me than like your regular kind of super villain that you would have had. In the same way that Heath Ledger's Joker did to me as well. And I think maybe in sort of grounding them a little bit, or making them a little less fantastical, they actually managed to do something a lot scarier.
No, I agree. But we don't have to talk about Glass kind of too much, but how do you think Kevin and I guess, all his personalities, the Beast specifically, kind of work within this grounded superhero reality? And especially, because of the reveal that this is in fact a sequel to Unbreakable.
Oh, what a great twist that is.
Oh my God.
I mean, in the cinema, I actually screamed.
Oh, me too. I mean, I screamed even like rewatching this film this morning. I was like, I knew it was coming, but it's great. I love it so much. I like that was such a fuck my question. Let's talk about the reveal. Like, tell me about the moment when the reveal came. What do you remember?
Well, I just remember feeling that like this is what a twist should be. Where, unlike so many films where you have a twist that like feels like a little bit of a betrayal, and it can be like a bit of a shock and a bit of a feeling that like what you've seen before has been tricking you. This is just like a kind of delightful extra layer of context on everything that reframes everything in like such a fun way. And it's just that kind of rug pull of like, haha, you thought you were watching one type of movie and you're watching a completely different type of one. And I just absolutely loved it. And particularly like with the news with Bruce Willis, and it's like so sad to hear that like he's so unwell now. Yeah. Like it's just a little thrill in this moment to kind of, that he's unveiled like such a kind of jewel, and like he's got, it's horrible to see that like because of his health, and he became like a butt of a joke in many ways, and like fuck the Razzies for doing that with their like worst Bruce Willis performance category. But it's kind of nice to see him on that movie star pedestal where they kind of, present him as like, they pull the curtain back on like, look at this like treasure of like a character. And it's so like lovingly done as well. And it's just one of those things that we talked about with like how he's got such a great command of the form that even like the tension, the way that there is that slow movement of the camera through the diner, and then he kind of emerges out from behind those two women. It's freaking delicious.
Oh God, it's the right word. It's just like you kind of know because the music starts playing and the camera starts moving so slowly up to him, and like you just feel it. You just feel like it's gonna be him, but it would make no sense. And then when he finally just arrives, and just with this is how much Bruce Willis is a fucking movie star. Just with a single tilt of his head, I'm gone. I'm done for. I'm like, yes, I've been waiting for 10 years for this. Every single time I've watched this film, I rewatched it this morning before recording, and I was like, I can't, I know it's coming, and yet I'm already sort of trembling with anticipation. Like, I love it. Just show me the tilt, Bruce. And yes, I think, as much as we all kind of, I think, I'm certainly guilty of like making fun of some of the later Bruce Willis films, but like when you get these big movie stars, these huge screen presences, even for a tiny sliver of a moment on screen, god damn it works so well. And I remember being at like a press screening of the film at that time, and obviously just like, oh, it's James McAvoy, that's the whole selling point. And then when that happened, I could not breathe. I think the entire screening room just stopped breathing. It was just such a moment.
I know, and like the confidence of it all, that everybody's going to exactly remember this character from 10 years ago.
Also because Unbreakable is a fucking awesome movie.
Unbreakable's great.
Yeah.
And I know that Glass is not technically a good film, but you know how people say that M. Night does not have a good sense of humour? I say building up a sort of cinematic universe around superheroes only to completely destroy it in one of the least cinematic deaths I've ever seen is one of the funniest fucking things I've seen in my entire life.
Please elaborate on that.
I'm sorry, that is some king shit, as they say.
As the kids say.
as the kids say, it is the exact opposite of Morbius, like, which is just trying to set up more, artistically bankrupt, like, bullshit sequels and try and squeeze every penny out of, like, your IP as possible. No. He went the exact other route, which is not only hilarious, but is kind of everything that we need in filmmaking nowadays. It's got integrity. It's got and instead he went off and, he's just like, no, I'm not going to make a big superhero franchise. I'm going to make like weird films about people getting old on a beach, which also great movie. I will defend Old with my dying breath.
Hey, I loved Old.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Again, that's a gorgeous, gorgeous film. And, there's stuff that I will defend when it comes from M. Night, and I'm not sure why, which I would not love for other people. Like, I think it's so wonderful how he is, like, getting his daughters to direct. Like, they're directing, I think they were doing second unit on Old, and another one was doing, she did episodes of Servant and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, normally I'd be like, oh, nepotism. But, like, in this, I think it's wonderful.
I mean, I will say, I think that's a you thing. I think that's you're recategorizing things because of your love of M. Night.
I definitely. Oh, yeah. No, I am under no illusions as to my biases, but there's just something about the way that I felt he was kind of treated. I think a lot of it kind of was slightly racist, if I'm honest, but like there was also a kind of like, we're gonna build someone up only to like tear them down.
Oh, 100%.
Like, oh, you think you're the new Spielberg? And it's like, no, you guys said that about me. I'm kind of got a much weirder sensibility than that. And then and then there was just kind of, I just thought people were so fast to like try and like mock him and to prove that actually he wasn't really that great. And I think he is great.
You know what I also think that like it's the reason why I wanted to put this film in this series. I think it's actually a horror film. It's not a thriller. Like this is full on horror. And
agreed.
I think like it's one of those films where people shied away from calling it a horror film because I think it's tied into those expectations placed on M. Night, and I think it was wise to sort of shy away from them a little bit to expand the sort of audience and also temper expectations. Because I think that's, one of the complicated reasons why I think like people build him up and then everyone just expected The Sixth Sense, and that's not, you can't really force that on a filmmaker. And the other thing is that because like people talk about it as a James McAvoy film, they talk about it as a weird superhero film, they talk or villain origin story, I guess. They talk about it as an M. Night Shyamalan film, but they never talk about it as a teenage girl film. And I always remember like the biggest part of half of this movie is spent with 3 teenage girls who have been kidnapped by a mentally unwell man, kept in a dungeon. 3 teenage girls who, like, 2 of them don't like the third one. So there's like an interesting dynamic between them already going on. And then also they are one by one killed off. And half of the movie is them trying to escape and failing. And there was so much tension between them and and their like surroundings.
Yeah, it is funny how kind of shallow the other 2 girls are. They're not given much to do, are they, in retrospect?
No, not really.
I mean, I think Anya Taylor-Joy has just got like a kind of movie star presence straight out of the gate from the Vivitch, as I will insist on calling it.
The Vitch.
The Vivitch. And and I think part of that is like physical, because she does just have like such giant eyes and this like strange ethereal quality literally naturally to her face, and like the fact that she can act on top of that seems almost like unfair. But he really does not give the other 2 much to do. I mean, I do like that they're not kind of like completely 2-dimensional shallow like tropes of like, like the bitchy high school girl, and like they do have like a level of human empathy towards Casey even from the beginning, even if they find her like strange and unsettling. But yeah, I mean, we spend more time with, the interiority of Hedwig than we do on either of them.
Yeah, we do. I mean, the other teenage girls don't really feel... they are much more props than Casey is. Like, it's basically how much longer do we need to have them until we're just left with Casey and Kevin and his several personalities. But to round off...
like cannon fodder. Like, they're just there to be hurt.
Exactly. Although, thankfully, we are kind of spared quite a lot of that. Like, the dread is there, the suspense is there, and we know what's happened, but we're kind of spared some of the violence, which I also think is one of the reasons why Kevin is both more terrifying but also more sympathetic at the same time. We don't actually see him hurt anyone.
Yeah, but I like that it acknowledges like that threat of sexual violence without ever kind of showing it to us. Like, it is, we know that Dennis has got a sort of dark, some kind of dark sexual desires, particularly aimed at teenage girls. We do have hints, and of course, there is what happens to Casey with the abuse. But I think M. Night is wise to know that you can actually explore that without showing it. And that is a kind of something that is very sad about young womanhood, that there is a kind of omnipresence of like, sexual threat in like many of your interactions with men. It's just something that's kind of on the cards, I guess. And like that sort of, and I think that the teenage girls do know that like the moment that they're kidnapped, like that is likely.
Yes.
Which is horrible and awful. But yeah, that's what I mean. It's one of the reasons I think this is a horror film. I think because it's genuinely scary in that way.
So before we wrap up this episode, I wanted to ask you kind of I connected these two films because of the way that they both work within larger franchises, I guess, mini franchises, but without resting on those laurels too much. I mean, Evil Dead obviously is kind of, doing that a lot more, but the connection with the universes is very different. It's not as straight up as it could be, and also because of the fact that both Casey and Mia are troubled in different ways, and troubled and resilient in different ways. So having rewatched them for this and spoken about them for over an hour, what do you make kind of on rewatch of how these films connect together?
Interesting. I kind of just assumed you'd put them together because they're similar in time. But yeah, no, there are some overlapping themes. I should have known that, you being like the consummate programmer would like, are able to sort of curate these things.
I don't fuck around with my double bill, Slater. I do not fuck around.
You don't. It is. I suppose, I'm trying to think. I mean, I far prefer Split to Evil Dead. And I wonder whether that is because, as much as I do think there is, they both fundamentally have young women who are kind of recovering from trauma, then having new challenges brought their way, shall we say, new demons to fight. But neither of them, like, ever in their performances, both Jane Levy and Anya Taylor-Joy, ever sort of fully like let go of the kind of trauma that they already have. So I think what I liked very much in both of these is like that it is not a case of something bad happens to you and that you're fixed. And I think both actresses understood that very well. I think both filmmakers knew that as well. So as much as there are regressive elements in like both films with like the use of sexual violence and the use of like mental health and like all of those things. I do think that is still admirable, and probably why these are films that, like I said at the beginning, like these are comforting rewatches to me, and I feel like I feel kind of like nostalgically fond of both of them.
I think that's a cute note to end on. Unless you have anything else to add about either Evil Dead or Split.
Just that I hope that M. Night, and we talked recently like with the Northman and stuff, and we talk about how like, oh, we need this to do well at the box office so we get more of these like very distinct decent budget films that show that they can make money, and they make more of them. And I think nobody is doing more for that cause than M. Night, because his films make a hell of a lot of money, and they are always very distinctly him. So I'm very grateful to him existing in the universe.
I appreciate this intense devotion to M. Night Shyamalan from you, Layla.
I don't know where it came from, to be honest. I think it kind of snuck up on me. It honestly might have happened in the twist at the end of Split, because I've not known a joy like it. I feel like in that, like, yeah, Sixth Sense was great. I enjoyed Signs, aside from the ending. I enjoyed, like, all of this. And I think, actually, it was just that Bruce Willis in a diner, and I was just like, I will follow you to the ends of the earth, M. Night.
You know what? That tracks. And if that is your M. Night origin story, then I respect it immensely, because that scene is perfect. Layla, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. And I know you do a lot of things, so where can people find more of your work online if they want to listen to more?
They are. I'm pretty much post everything that I do, which is my Twitter, Layla_Latif. If you read the new issue of Total Film, I've got a lot in that, talking about missing movies and all of the different films that have been lost in various different ways, and also talking to some people about the film Pleasure, the director and the stars of that movie, which is an amazing film about a young Swedish girl trying to become a porn star. Read that, but also definitely watch that film. And I am taking over as the host of Truth in Movies, so you can also listen to me on that podcast, I think from next week.
Lovely. Thanks so much again.